was thinking about these remarks, I had two topics in mind, couldn't decide between them, actually pretty obvious ones. One topic is, what are the most important issues that we face? The second topic is, what issues are not being treated seriously or at all in the quadrennial frenzy now underway called an election. But I realized that there's no problem. It's not a hard choice. They're the same topic. And there are reasons for it, which are very significant in themselves. I'd like to return to that in a moment, but first a few words on the background, beginning with the announced title, Who Owns the World? Actually, a good answer to this was given years ago by Adam Smith, someone we're supposed to worship but not read. He was it's a little subversive when you read him sometimes. He was referring to the most powerful country in the world in his day, and of course the country that interested him, namely England. And he pointed out that in England, the principal architects of policy are those who own the country, the merchants and manufacturers in his day. And he said they make sure to design policy so that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to. Their interests are served by policy, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. But he was an old-fashioned conservative with moral principles, so he added the victims of England, the victims of what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, particularly in India. Well, he had no illusions about the owners. So to quote him again, all for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. It was true then, it's true now. Britain kept its position as the dominant world power well into the 20th century, despite steady decline. By the end of World War II, dominance had shifted decisively into the hands of the upstart across the sea, the United States, by far the most powerful and wealthy society in world history. Britain could only aspire to be its junior partner, as the British Foreign Office ruefully recognized. At that point, 1945, the United States had literally half the world's wealth, incredible security, controlled the entire Western Hemisphere, both oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans. There's nothing, there has never been anything like that in history. And planners understood it. Roosevelt's planners were meeting right through the Second World War, designing the post-war world. They were quite sophisticated about it, and their plans were pretty much implemented. They wanted to make sure that the United States would control what they called a grand area, which would include routinely the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire Far East, the former British Empire, which the U.S. would be taking over, and as much of Eurasia as possible. Crucially, its commercial and industrial centers in Western Europe. And within this region, they said, the United States should hold unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy while ensuring the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with these global designs. And those were pretty realistic plans at the time, given the enormous disparity of power. The U.S. had been by far the richest country in the world even before the Second World War, although it was not yet the major global actor. During the Second World War, the United States gained enormously. Industrial production almost quadrupled, got us out of the Depression. And meanwhile, industrial rivals were devastated or seriously weakened. So that was an unbelievable system of power. Actually, the policies that were outlined then still hold. You can read them in government pronouncements, but the capacity to implement them has significantly declined. Actually, there's a major theme now in foreign policy discussion, journals and so on. The theme is called American decline. So, for example, in the most prestigious establishment, International Relations Journal, Foreign Affairs, a couple of months ago, there was an issue which had on the front cover in big, bold letters, "Is America over?" ? That's announcing the theme of the issue. And there's a standard corollary to this. Power is shifting to the West, to China and India, the rising world powers, which are going to be the hegemonic states of the future. Actually, I think the decline is quite real, but some serious qualifications are in order. First of all, the corollary is highly unlikely, at least in the foreseeable future. China and India are very poor countries. Just take a look at, say, the Human Development Index of the United Nations. They're way down there. China's around 90th. I think India's around 120th or so, last time I looked. And they have tremendous internal problems, demographic problems, extreme poverty, hopeless inequality, ecological problems. China's a great manufacturing center, but it's actually mostly an assembly plant. So it assembles parts and components, high technology that comes from the surrounding more advanced industrial centers, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, the United States, Europe, and it basically assembles them. So if, say, you buy one of these things, an iPad from China, it's called an export from China, but the parts and components and technology come from outside. And the value added in China is minuscule. It's been calculated. They'll move up the technology ladder, but it's a hard climb. India even harder. So I think one should be skeptical about the corollary. But there's another qualification that's more serious. The decline is real, but it's not new. It's been going on since 1945. In fact, it happened very quickly. In the late 1940s, there's an event that's known here as the loss of China. China became independent. That's a loss of a huge piece of the grand area of Asia. And it became a major issue in American domestic policy. Who's responsible for the loss of China? A lot of recriminations and so on. Actually, the phrase is kind of interesting. Like, I can't lose your computer, right? Because I don't own it. I can lose my computer. Well, the phrase loss of China kind of presupposes a deeply held principle of kind of American elite consciousness. We own the world. And if some piece of it becomes independent, we've lost it. And that's a terrible loss. We got to do something about it. It's never questioned, which is interesting in itself. Well, right about the same time, around 1950, concerns developed about the loss of Southeast Asia. And that's what led the United States into the Indochina Wars, the worst atrocities of the post-war period. Partly lost, partly not. A very significant event in modern history was in 1965, when in Indonesia, which was the main concern, that's the country of Southeast Asia with most of the wealth and resources, there was a military coup in Indonesia. Suharto coup. It led to an extraordinary massacre, what the New York Times called a staggering mass slaughter. Killed hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants, destroyed the only mass political party, and opened the country up to Western exploitation. Euphoria in the West was so enormous that it couldn't be contained. So in the New York Times, describing the staggering mass slaughter, it called it a gleam of light in Asia. That was a column written by James Reston, the leading liberal thinker in the Times, and the same elsewhere. Europe, Australia. It was a fantastic event. Years later, McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, in retrospect, he pointed out that probably would have been a good idea to end the Vietnam War at that point, to pull out. Contrary to a lot of illusions, the Vietnam War was fought primarily to ensure that an independent Vietnam would not develop successfully and become a model for other countries in the region. It would not, to borrow Henry Kissinger's terminology, speaking about Chile, we have to prevent it, what he called the virus of independent development from spreading contagion elsewhere. That's a critical part of American foreign policy since the Second World War, Britain, France, others to a lesser degree. And by 1965, that was over. South Vietnam was virtually destroyed. The war had spread to the rest of Indochina. It wasn't going to be a model for anyone. And the contagion was contained. The Suharto regime made sure that Indonesia wouldn't be infected, and pretty soon the U.S. had dictatorships in every country of the region. Marcos in the Philippines, a dictatorship in Thailand, Chun in South Park in South Korea. It was no problem about the infection. So that would have been a good time to end the Vietnam War, he felt. Well, that's Southeast Asia. But the decline continues. In the last 10 years, there's been a very important event, the loss of South America. For the first time in 500 years, since the conquistadors, the South American countries have begun to move towards independence and a degree of integration. The typical structure of one of the South American countries was a tiny, very rich, westernized elite, often white or mostly white, and a huge mass of horrible poverty, countries separated from one another, each oriented towards its, either Europe or more recently the United States. Last 10 years, that's been overcome significantly, beginning to integrate, the prerequisite for independence, even beginning to face some of their horrendous internal problems. That's the loss of South America. One sign is that the United States has been driven out of every single military base in South America, trying to restore a few, but right now there are none. Well, moving on to just last year, the Arab Spring is another such threat. It threatens to take that big region out of the grand area. That's a lot more significant than Southeast Asia or South America. You go back to the 1940s, the State Department recognized that the energy resources of the Middle East are what they called one of the greatest material prizes in world history, a spectacular source of strategic power. If we can control Middle East energy, we can control the world. You take a look at the U.S.-British coup in Iran in 1953. Very important event. Its shadows cast over the world until today. That was a pretense that it was part of the Cold War. It had nothing to do with the Cold War. What it had to do was the usual fear, independent nationalism. And it wasn't even concerned with access to oil or profits. It was concerned with control of the oil resources of Iran and, in fact, of the region. And that's a theme that runs right through policy decisions, not discussed much, but it's very important to have control, exactly as State Department advisors pointed out in the 40s. If you can control the oil, you can control most of the world, and that goes on. So far, the threat of the Arab Spring has been pretty well contained. In the oil dictatorships, which are the most important ones for the West, every effort to join the Arab Spring has just been crushed by force. Saudi Arabia was so extreme that when there was an effort to go out into the streets, the security presence was so enormous that people were even afraid to go out. There's a little discussion of what goes on in Bahrain, where it's been crushed, but eastern Saudi Arabia was much worse. The Emirates, totally controlled. So that's okay. We managed to ensure that the threat of democracy would be smashed in the most important places. Egypt is an interesting case. It's an important country, not an oil producer. It is a small one. But in Egypt, the United States followed a standard operating procedure. If any of you are going into the diplomatic service, you might as well learn it. There's a standard procedure when one of your favorite dictators gets into trouble. First, you support him as long as possible. But if it becomes really impossible, say the army turns against him, then you send him out to pasture and get the intellectual class to issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy, and then try to restore the old system as much as possible. There's case after case of that. Somoza in Nicaragua, Duvalier in Haiti, Marcos in the Philippines, Chun in South Korea, Mobutu in the Congo, over and over. I mean, it takes genius not to see it. And it's exactly what was done in Egypt and what France tried to do, not quite with as much success in Tunisia. Well, the future is uncertain, but the threat of democracy so far is contained, and it's a real threat. I'll return to that. It's also important to recognize that the decline over the past 50 years is, to a significant extent, self-inflicted, particularly since the 70s. I'll come back to that too. But first, let me say a couple of things about the issues that are most important today and that are being ignored or not dealt with seriously in the electoral campaigns for good reasons. So let me start with the most important issues. There are two of these. They're of overwhelming significance because the fate of the species depends on them. One is environmental disaster, the other's nuclear war. I'm not going to take much time reviewing the threats of environmental disaster. Actually, they're on the front pages almost daily. So, for example, last week, the New York Times had a front page story with the headline, "Ending its Summer Melt. Arctic sea ice sets a new low." That leads to warnings. The melting this summer was far faster than was predicted by the sophisticated computer models and the most recent United Nations report. It's now predicted that the summer ice might be gone by 2020. It was assumed before that it may be 2050. They quoted scientists who said, "This is a prime example of the built-in conservatism of our climate forecasts. As dire the warnings are about the long-term consequences of heat-trapping emissions, many of us fear that they may still be underestimating the speed and severity of the impending changes." Actually, there's a climate change study program at MIT where I am. They've been warning about this for years and repeatedly have been proven right. The Times report discusses briefly the severe impact of all of this on the global climate, and it adds, but governments have not responded to the change with any greater urgency about limiting greenhouse emissions. To the contrary, their main response has been to plan for exploitation of newly accessible minerals in the Arctic, including drilling for more oil. That is, to accelerate the catastrophe. That's quite interesting. It demonstrates an extraordinary willingness to sacrifice the lives of our children and grandchildren for short-term gain, or perhaps an equally remarkable willingness to shut our eyes so as not to see impending peril. Those things you sometimes find with young infants. Something looks dangerous, close my eyes and won't look at it. Well, there is another possibility. I mean, maybe humans are somehow trying to fulfill a prediction of great American biologist who died recently, Ernst Mayr. He argued years ago that intelligence seems to be a lethal mutation. And he had some pretty good evidence. There's a notion of biological success, which is how many of you are there around? You know, that's biological success. And he pointed out that if you look at the tens of billions of species in world history, the ones that are very successful are the ones that mutate very quickly, like bacteria, or the ones that have a fixed ecological niche, like beetles. They seem to make out fine. But as you move up the scale of what we call intelligence, success declines steadily. When you get up to mammals, it's very low. There are very few of them around. And there's a lot of cows. It's only because we domesticate them. When you get to humans, it's the same. Till very recently, much too recent a time to show up in any evolutionary accounting, humans were very scattered. There were plenty of other hominids, but they disappeared, probably because humans exterminated them, but nobody knows for sure. Anyhow, maybe we're trying to show that humans just fit into the general pattern. We can exterminate ourselves too, the rest of the world with us, and we're hell-bent on it right now. Well, let's turn to the elections. Both political parties demand that we make the problem worse. In 2008, both party platforms devoted some space to how the government should address climate change. Today, in the Republican platform, the issue has essentially disappeared. But the platform does demand that Congress take quick action to prevent the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating greenhouse gases. So let's make sure to make it worse. And it also demands that we open Alaska's Arctic refuge to drilling, I'm quoting now, in order to take advantage of all of our American God-given resources. You can't disobey God, after all. On environmental policy, the program says we must restore scientific integrity to our public research institutions and remove political incentives from publicly funded research. All of that's a code word for climate science. Stop funding climate science. Romney himself says there's no scientific consensus, so we should support more debate and investigation within the scientific community, but no action except to act to make the problems worse. Well, what about the Democrats? They concede that there's a problem and advocate that we should work toward an agreement to set emissions limits in unison with other emerging powers. But that's it, no action. And in fact, as Obama has emphasized, we have to work hard to gain what he calls 100 years of energy independence by exploiting domestic or Canadian resources, by fracking and other elaborate technologies. It doesn't ask what the world will look like in 100 years. So there are differences. The differences are basically about how enthusiastically the lemmings should march towards the cliff. Let's turn to the second major issue, nuclear war. It's also on the front pages daily, but in a way that would seem outlandish to some independent observer viewing what's going on Earth, and in fact does seem outlandish to a considerable majority of the countries of the world. The current threat, not for the first time, is in the Middle East, focusing on Iran. The general picture in the West is very clear. It's far too dangerous to allow Iran to reach what's called nuclear capability. That is, the capability enjoyed by many powers, dozens of them, to produce nuclear weapons if they decide to do so. As to whether they've decided, U.S. intelligence says it doesn't know. The International Atomic Energy Agency just produced its most recent report a couple of weeks ago, and it concludes, I'll quote it, "It cannot demonstrate the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in Iran." That is, it can't demonstrate something which a condition that can't be satisfied. There's no way to demonstrate the absence of the work. That's convenient. Therefore, Iran must be denied the right to enrich uranium. That's guaranteed to every power that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, that's the picture in the West. That's not the picture in the rest of the world. As you know, I'm sure there was just a meeting of the non-aligned movement. That's a large majority of the countries in the world and of representing most of the world's population, a meeting in Tehran. And once again, not for the first time, they issued a ringing declaration of support for Iran's right to enrich uranium, right that every country has that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Pretty much the same is true in the Arab world. It's interesting. I'll return to that in a moment. There is a basic reason for the concern. It was expressed succinctly by General Lee Butler. He's the former head of the U.S. Strategic Command, which controls nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. He wrote that it is dangerous in the extreme that in the cauldron of animosities that we call the Middle East, one nation should arm itself with nuclear weapons, which may inspire other nations to do so. General Butler, however, was not referring to Iran. He was referring to Israel, the country that ranks highest in European polls as the most dangerous country in the world, right above Iran, and not incidentally in the Arab world, where the public regard the United States as the second most dangerous country right after Israel. In the Arab world, Iran, though disliked, ranks far lower as a threat among the populations, that is, not the dictatorships. With regard to Iranian nuclear weapons, nobody wants them to have them, but in many polls, majorities, sometimes considerable majorities, have said that the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons to balance those of their major threats. Now, there's a lot of commentary in the Western media and journals about Arab attitudes towards Iran. And what you read commonly is that the Arabs want decisive action against Iran, which is true of the dictators. It's not true of the populations. But who cares about the populations, what are called disparagingly the Arab street? We don't care about them. That's a reflection of the extremely deep contempt for democracy among Western elites. I mean, so deep that it can't be perceived. You know, it's just kind of like reflexive. The study of popular attitudes in the Arab world, and there is very extensive study by Western polling agencies, it reveals very quickly why the U.S. and its allies are so concerned about the threat of democracy and are doing what they can to prevent it. They certainly don't want attitudes like those I've just indicated to become policy, while of course issuing rousing statements about our passionate dedication to democracy. Those are relayed obediently by reporters and commentators. Well, unlike Iran, Israel refuses to allow inspections at all, refuses to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has hundreds of nuclear weapons, has advanced delivery systems. Also, it has a long record of violence and repression. It has annexed and settled conquered territories illegally, violation of Security Council orders, many acts of aggression, 5 times against Lebanon alone, no credible pretext. New York Times yesterday, you can read that the Golan Heights are disputed territory, Syrian Golan Heights. There is a UN Security Council resolution 497, which is unanimous, declaring Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights illegal and demanding that it be rescinded. And in fact, it's disputed only in Israel and in the New York Times, which in fact is reflecting actual U.S. policy, not formal U.S. policy. Iran has a record of aggression too. In the last several hundred years, it has invaded and conquered a couple of Arab islands. Now, that was under the Shah, U.S.-imposed dictator with U.S. support. That's actually the only case in several hundred years. Meanwhile, the severe threats of attack continue. You've just been hearing them at the UN from the United States, but particularly Israel. There is a reaction to this at the highest level in the United States. Leon Panetta, Secretary of Defense, he said that we don't want to attack Iran. We hope that Israel won't attack Iran, but Israel's a sovereign country and they have to make their own decisions about what they'll do. You might ask what the reaction would be if you reverse the cast of characters. And those of you who have antiquarian interests might remember that there's a document called the United Nations Charter, the foundation of modern international law, which bars the threat or use of force in international affairs. There are two rogue states, United States and Israel, which regard the Charter and international law as just a boring irrelevance, so do what they like, and that's accepted. Well, these are not just words. There is an ongoing war. Includes terrorism, assassination of nuclear scientists, includes economic war, U.S. threats, not international ones, U.S. threats have cut Iran out of the international financial system. Western military analysts identify what they call weapons of finance as acts of war that justify violent response when they're directed against us, that is. Cutting Iran out of global financial markets is different. The United States is openly carrying out extensive cyber war against Iran. That's praised. The Pentagon regards cyber war as an equivalent to an armed attack, which justifies military response, but that's, of course, when it's directed against us. The leading liberal figure in the State Department, Harold Koh, is the top State Department legal advisor. He says that cyber war is an act of war if it results in significant destruction, like the attacks against Iranian nuclear facilities. And such acts, he says, justify force in self-defense. But of course, he means only attacks against the United States or its clients. Well, Israel's lethal armory, which is enormous, includes advanced submarines recently provided by Germany. These are capable of carrying Israel's nuclear-tipped missiles, and these are sure to be deployed in the Persian Gulf or nearby if Israel proceeds with its plans to bomb Iran, or more likely, I suspect, to try to set up conditions in which the United States will do so. And the United States, of course, has a vast array of nuclear weapons all over the world, but surrounding the region from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, including enough firepower in the Persian Gulf to destroy most of the world. Another story that's in the news right now is the Israeli bombing of the Iraqi reactor in Osirak, which is suggested as a model for Israeli bombing of Iran. It's rarely mentioned, however, that the bombing of the Osirak reactor didn't end Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program, it initiated it. There was no program before it, and the Osirak reactor was not capable of producing uranium for nuclear weapons. But of course, after the bombing, Saddam immediately turned to developing a nuclear weapons program, and if Iran is bombed, it's almost certain to proceed just as Saddam Hussein did after the Osirak bombing. Well, in a few weeks, we'll be commemorating the 50th anniversary of the most dangerous moment in human history. Now, those are the words of historian, Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger, is referring, of course, to the October 1962 missile crisis, the most dangerous moment in human history, others agree. At that time, Kennedy raised the nuclear alert to the second highest level, just short of launching weapons. He authorized NATO aircraft with Turkish or other pilots to take off, fly to Moscow, and drop bombs, setting off a likely nuclear conflagration. At the peak of the missile crisis, Kennedy estimated the probability of nuclear war at perhaps 50%. It's a war that would destroy the Northern Hemisphere, President Eisenhower had warned. And facing that risk, Kennedy refused to agree publicly to an offer by Khrushchev to end the crisis by simultaneous withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and U.S. missiles from Turkey. These were obsolete missiles. They were already being replaced by invulnerable Polaris submarines. But it was felt necessary to firmly establish the principle that Russia has no right to have any offensive weapons anywhere beyond the borders of the USSR, even to defend an ally against U.S. attack. That's now recognized to be the prime reason for deploying missiles there, and actually a plausible one. Meanwhile, the United States must retain the right to have them all over the world, targeting Russia or China or any other enemy. In fact, in 1962, we've just recently learned, the United States had just secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Okinawa aimed at China. That was a moment of elevated regional tensions. All of that is very consistent with grand area conceptions, the ones I mentioned that were developed by Roosevelt's planners. Well, fortunately, in 1962, Khrushchev backed down, but the world can't be assured of such sanity forever. And particularly threatening, in my view, is that intellectual opinion and even scholarship hail Kennedy's behavior as his finest hour. My own view is it's one of the worst moments in history. Inability to face the truth about ourselves is all too common a feature of the intellectual culture. Also, personal life has ominous implications. Well, 10 years later, in 1973, during the Israel-Arab War, Henry Kissinger called a high-level nuclear alert. The purpose was to warn the Russians to keep hands off while he was, so we have recently learned, he was secretly informing Israel that they were authorized to violate the ceasefire that had been imposed jointly by the U.S. and Russia. When Reagan came into office a couple of years later, the United States launched operations probing Russian defenses, flying into Russia to probe defenses, and simulating air and naval attacks, and meanwhile placing Pershing missiles in Germany that had a 5-minute flight time to Russian targets. They were providing what the CIA called a super sudden first strike capability. The Russians, not surprisingly, were deeply concerned. Actually, that led to a major war scare in 1983. There have been hundreds of cases when human intervention aborted a first strike launch just minutes before launch. That's after automated systems gave false alarms. We don't have Russian records, but there's no doubt that their systems are far more accident-prone. Actually, it's a near miracle that nuclear war has been avoided so far. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan have come close to nuclear war several times, and the crises that led to that, especially Kashmir, remain. Both India and Pakistan have refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, along with Israel, and both of them have received U.S. support for development of their nuclear weapons programs, actually until today in the case of India, which is now a U.S. ally. War threats in the Middle East, which could become reality very soon, once again escalate the dangers. Well, fortunately, there's a way out of this, a simple way. There's a way to mitigate, maybe end, whatever threat Iran is alleged to pose. Very simple. Move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. The opportunity is coming again this December. There's an international conference scheduled to deal with this proposal. It has overwhelming international support, including, incidentally, a majority of the population in Israel. That's fortunately. Unfortunately, it's blocked by the United States and Israel. A couple of days ago, Israel announced that it's not going to participate and it won't consider the matter until there's a general regional peace. Obama takes the same stand. He also insists that any agreement must exclude Israel and even must exclude calls for other nations, meaning the U.S., to provide information about Israeli nuclear activities. The United States and Israel can delay regional peace indefinitely. They've been doing that for 35 years on Israel-Palestine, virtual international isolation. It's a long, important story that I don't have time to go into here. So therefore, there's no hope for an easy way to end what the West regards as the most severe current crisis. In no way unless there's large-scale public pressure. But there can't be large-scale public pressure unless people at least know about it. And the media have done a stellar job in averting that danger. Nothing reported about the conference or about any of the background. No discussion, apart from specialist arms control journals where you can read about it. So that blocks the easy way to end the worst existing crisis unless people somehow find a way to break through this. Well, turning to the election, there's unanimity in ignoring all of this, not a word. The only issue discussed is should the United States agree with Israel's position. Israel's position is that the U.S. should establish a red line. The red line should be Iranian capability to produce nuclear weapons, the capability that a vast number of countries have. So if they reach capability, we should bomb them. That's Israel's position. It's also the position of the U.S. Senate. A couple of days ago, the Senate declared 90-1. The one exception was Ron Paul, 90-1 that the United States must accept Israel's position, establish a red line at capability, contrary to the White House. Well, that's the most important international issues. There are also quite crucial domestic issues. The most serious is that there are roughly 23 million people unemployed or underemployed or just given up. Now, that's a real catastrophe for the people themselves. You know, their lives are destroyed, their families are destroyed, and for the economy, huge resources not being used. Now, that does enter the elections. The Republicans have an answer to this. Now, we should enrich the rich. You don't use the word rich anymore. There's a euphemism. They're called the job creators. They don't create any jobs, but that's the way you refer to the rich. Sometimes they're called the makers, not the takers. So who are the takers? Well, that's easy. The big banks, for example, are enormous takers. They get $30 billion a year from just the government insurance policy alone, too big to fail policy. Some estimated at about $60 billion. The super rich are incredible takers. So you take a look at just the tax breaks. Tax breaks amount to more than 7% of GDP, gross domestic product. That's 2/5 as large as the entire federal government. The tax breaks are overwhelmingly regressive, favoring the rich. And how do they achieve that nice outcome? By lobbying heavily and systematically contributing to political campaigns. I'm quoting that radical rag, Foreign Affairs. There are many other regressive devices, patent laws designed to radically increase the price of drugs and others, research and development, procurement, all techniques for enriching the private sector. Particularly significant since the 1970s, a big change in the way the economy works then, particularly significant since then are financial institutions. There is a role for banks in a state capitalist economy. So, for example, what a bank is supposed to do is take your deposit and decide to lend it to somebody who wants to do something with it, like, buy a car, or send the kids to college, or start a business, buy a house, whatever it might be. That's the function of banks. And it was pretty well filled that during the great growth period, what's sometimes called the Golden Age, the 50s and the 60s, enormous growth period, pretty egalitarian. That's pretty much what banks were doing. At that time, the New Deal legislation still prevailed, including a fair amount of regulation, so there were no financial crises. Since the 1970s, that's all changed. There's been a huge explosion of financial institutions, mostly dedicated to financial manipulations. Take a look at the business pages of the New York Times today. There's a big debate about whether there should be some regulation on super fast automated trading, where you can cut a trade by, a microsecond or something and maybe beat somebody else out, which is causing all kind of problems. And Europe and Australia and Canada are trying to clamp down on it. The United States is hanging back, but there's plenty of this. By 2007, financial institutions had literally reached 40% of corporate profits. Well, what's the impact of this on the economy? Actually, before the recent crash, there was very little study of it. The reason is there's a kind of a religious doctrine. The doctrine is markets know best, so it had to be beneficial. So if you're a well-trained economist, you just don't look at it. After the crash, there was a kind of a change of mood, somewhat. So prominent international economists wrote, I'm quoting, that an emerging consensus is developing among economists on the need for macro-prudential supervision of financial markets. There's growing recognition that our financial system is running a doomsday cycle. That whenever it fails, we rely on lax money and fiscal policies to bail it out. Now, this response teaches the financial sector a lesson. Take large gambles to get paid handsomely, and don't worry about the costs. They'll be paid by the taxpayers through bailouts and lost jobs. And the financial system is thus resurrected to gamble again and to fail again. So I'm quoting Barry Eichengreen and Simon Johnson. Economists among you will know that they're among the most respected financial and international economists. The system is a doom loop, in the words of the official of the Bank of England who's responsible for financial stability. After the crisis, a number of very prominent economists did start to write about it. There's an issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that had articles by Benjamin Friedman at Harvard, Robert Solow at MIT, he's Nobel laureate. They both pointed out that there hadn't been much in the way of study of the impact of financial institutions. They didn't say why, but the reason is the religion. And they said when you look at it, said if you look at it carefully, it looks like they are imposing significant costs on the economy. The most respected financial commentator in the English-speaking world, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, he went well beyond that. He said, the out-of-control financial sector is eating out the modern market economy from inside, just as the larva of the spider wasp eats out the host in which it's been laid. Banks, as presently constituted and managed, cannot be trusted to perform any publicly important function. Today's banks represent the incarnation of profit-seeking behavior taken to its logical limits, in which the only question asked by the senior staff is, what can they get away with? That's not a spokesperson for the Occupy movement. It's the most respected financial correspondent in the English-speaking world, quite conservative, Martin Wolf. Actually, there's a study by two leading economists, one a Nobel laureate, Paul Romer and George Akerlof, who found that the most lucrative strategy for executives at big banks would be to loot them, to pay themselves vast rewards, knowing full well that the government, meaning the taxpayer, will move in and save them from bankruptcy. That was 20 years ago. It's a lot worse today. There are some limited steps to try to deal with this, but they're being beaten back by armies of lobbyists. Well, that's the takers. What about the makers, working people? They're under constant attack. The fiscal policies and trade policies are designed to undermine manufacturing, to set workers in competition with each other around the world, with the poorest, to drive down wages. Meanwhile, protect professionals. They're given all kinds of protections. They're not supposed to compete. Unions are under terrific attack. It's been going on since the 1940s, but in the last generation, it's been very harsh. Employers have been basically told that they can violate the laws at will, and of course they're following it. Clinton, that was Reagan. Clinton, which led to about a tripling of firing of organizers illegally. Clinton added his own method. It was called NAFTA. NAFTA gave opportunities for employers to threaten to move plants to Mexico in order to break strikes. That's illegal, of course, but when you have a criminal state, it's fine to act illegally. That, under a NAFTA study, that led to a very sharp increase in breaking strikes illegally. By now, they practically don't exist. Private sector unionization is down to about 7%. Public workers have so far defended themselves, but they're under terrific attack. No time to go into it, but I should mention that Obama takes part in it. All of this has been accelerated under a strong right-wing backlash that took place, backlash against the 60s, that took place from the early 70s. Major change in the nature of the economy towards financialization, leading to what I described, and offshoring. That led very quickly to concentration of wealth. Concentration of wealth leads to concentration of political power, almost reflexively. That leads to legislation to enhance the process, the vicious cycle, fiscal policy, deregulation, rules of corporate governance, quite a lot. So the vicious cycle goes on. And it leads to what in the Occupy slogan, which has now become prevalent, the 1%, 99% distinction. Actually, 1% is wrong. It's more like 0.1% versus the rest if you actually look at income distribution. It's highly concentrated in a fraction of 1%, CEOs, hedge fund managers, and so on. For the majority, it's stagnation and decline. Meanwhile, costs of elections have skyrocketed. The Supreme Court just has given its help a couple of times. There are studies of the outcome by very good political scientists. The most recent one, good book by Martin Gilens, concludes that 70% of the public are powerless to shape government policy, his phrase. Meanwhile, the rich get what they want, and the mechanisms are by no means obscure. This has changed the political parties. The Republicans, some time ago, abandoned any pretense of being a normal parliamentary party. They are just dedicated, lockstep, with a kind of catechism that everyone has to repeat towards service to the super rich and the corporate sector. You can't get votes that way. So they've been compelled to mobilize sectors of the population that have always been there and are substantial, but were never politically mobilized before. The United States, as you know, is an unusually religious, fundamentalist religious country, off the international spectrum. I mean, almost half the population thinks the world was created a couple of thousand years ago with all the fossils and everything else. About a third of the population believes that every word of the Bible is literally true. Two-thirds expect the second coming, half of them in their lifetime, and on and on. I don't think there's anything like this close to it anywhere in the world. Now, it goes far back. Actually, it goes to the colonists. But it's always been there. It's never really been mobilized as a political force. Now it is, and for good reasons. You've got to get voters somehow. There's also a nativist tradition. People are afraid that, they're coming after us. And it's amazing to watch. So Rand Paul, who's the young libertarian hero in the Senate, right now he's organizing a campaign to try to get people to block the Small Arms Treaty at the United Nations. It's an important treaty. Small arms are massacring people all over the world, and almost 80% come from the United States. But he has a rationale. He says the Arms Control Treaty is a plot by the United Nations and the socialists, or radicals, Obama and Clinton, to try to take away our arms so that when the UN comes to attack us, we won't be able to defend ourselves. You can't find this anywhere in the world, nothing remotely like it. But these sectors are there. They've been around. It's old traditions. They're now being mobilized because there's no other way to get votes. And that's why you get what you've just seen in the Republican primaries. I mean, near lunacy. People in the rest of the world are looking at this and can't believe what's happening in the country. Well, what's happening is quite understandable. When one of the two political parties abandons any pretense of being a parliamentary party, just serves the super rich, lockstep uniformity, there's no other way for them to survive. They've got to mobilize these sectors to get votes. That's what's happening. It's commonly said that moderate Republicans have disappeared, which is not quite true. They are now centrist Democrats, and the Democratic Party is veered to the right as well, seeking the same corporate dollars, not quite as fast. Well, there's a recent study by the Economic Policy Institute, that's the major source of regular, reliable information on and analysis of the economy. The recent study is called Failure by Design. It reviews the data. It's simple. It's worth reading. It's a very simple presentation of a lot of data. It reviews the data on the impact of the, are called the neoliberal policies of the past generation, which includes astonishing concentration of wealth, while wages and incomes have stagnated or declined. Working hours have increased far beyond Europe. The weak benefit system has eroded. This, incidentally, in the richest and most powerful country in history with extraordinary advantages. The authors of the study point out that the failure they refer to is class-based. So the designers, they've achieved spectacular success. And they also stress that it is design. That is, there have been alternative policies. They were always possible, they still are. But it will take the kind of activism that brought about the New Deal, progressive step in the 60s, back to much earlier days, in order to do something about this. I mean, progress doesn't come as a gift from above. The post-Golden Age economy, the one reviewed by this pamphlet, it's actually enacting a nightmare that was envisaged by the classical economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Both of them recognized, they're talking about England, of course, they recognized that if British merchants and manufacturers invested abroad and relied on imports, they would profit, but England would suffer. Both of them hoped that these consequences would be averted by what's called in the literature home bias. That is a preference to do business in the home country and see the home country grow and develop. Therefore, as if by an invisible hand, England would be saved from the ravages of global markets. Actually, that's the one occurrence of the famous phrase, invisible hand, in Smith's classic Wealth of Nations. It's pretty hard to miss. It's the only occurrence, and it's basically an argument against neoliberal globalization. David Ricardo, his successor, hoped that thanks to home bias, I'm quoting him now, most men of property would be satisfied with the low rate of profits in their own country rather than seek a more advantageous employment for their wealth in foreign nations, feelings that I would be sorry to see weakened. same point, essentially. Actually, that one was brought to light, I didn't know it before, in an important book on globalization that was produced here by the Political Economy Research Institute. In the past 30 years, Adam Smith's masters of mankind have abandoned sentimental concerns for the welfare of their own society, concentrating instead on short-term gain, huge bonuses, the country be damned, as long as the powerful nanny state remains intact to serve their interests. The developing picture is very aptly described in a brochure for investors that was produced by Citigroup. It's a huge investment bank and so on that's once again feeding at the public trough. It's been doing that regularly for 30 years in a cycle of risky loans, huge profits, crash, bailout by the public. The bank's analysts, this is a brochure for investors, they describe a world that's dividing into two blocks, one of which they call the plutonomy. Then there's the rest, the vast majority. Now they're sometimes called the global precariat, those who are living a precarious existence, whether or not they're lucky enough to get employment. In the United States, they're subject to growing worker insecurity. That, if you didn't know, is the basis for a healthy economy. Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan explained that to Congress while he was lauding his performance in economic management. Actually, that's the real shift in global society, and not to China and India, but to the global plutonomy. And the Citigroup analysts understand it. They advise investors to focus on the very rich, where the action is. They have something called a plutonomy stock basket, which is investments on things that the rich want. And they point out that it's far outperformed the world index of developed markets since 1985. That's when the Reagan-Thatcher economic programs of enriching the very rich and punishing the rest were taking off. And by shredding the remnants of political democracy, the masters also lay the basis for carrying the lethal process forward, and will continue to do so as long as their victims are willing to suffer in silence, which is always a choice and never a necessity. Thanks.